Those who are not physically with us. Why don't you come closer? Because our speaker actually requested it, so I'm speaking on her behalf. We're going to have a very different type of session today that was determined by the powers above because the slides somehow aren't working. So, good evening to everybody and welcome to the Art Science Lecture Series. My name is Victoria Vesna and I started this center recently, and I'm very excited actually about bringing in art and science specifically for addressing aesthetic, ecological, environmental, and social issues. And for that reason, I'm particularly excited to have Linda Weintraub here, who is a well-known author from New York who has written The Avant-Gardians, Textlets in Ecology and Art, which is a recent project. The project before is called In the Making, Creative Options for Creative Artists 2003, which, by the way, for students, I highly recommend this book because it's all about the process, and she covers artists from many different fields. And then Art on the Edge and Over, some of you may be familiar with it, is an earlier book that really brought her into prominence. I went and visited Linda a few months ago, actually. Time flies. And I have to say, we talked back and forth, and our talks were very much about how technology can play in this, because she actually doesn't come from that world. But we were both intersecting in thinking about humanity and environmental issues, and in relation to time initially. Then she invited me last year to the College Art Association conference to participate in the all-day workshop called Ecotistical Art, which I love just the concept of it. And of course today she's presented CycleLogical art, recycling practices. She practices what she preaches, by the way, because when I visited her in her home upstate New York, it was really like an artwork. It was really seeing how someone who's a theoretician, a curator, and a critic puts their words into practice. The home is over homes. It's actually kind of a modular structure. I wish you had pictures, but you can at least talk about it a little bit. It's all a kind of an ecological space made out of hangers and recyclable materials, and there's animals, and it's just absolutely gorgeous and very, very beautiful and artistic. And so today she will speak to us about her whole new effort that's dealing with cycleological art making. For me personally, there's no more important issue on the planet today than the planet itself and the environment. And I don't think it's flaky, I don't think it's unhip, I think it's really critical. It's urgent. It's important that we use our practice, no matter how abstract, poetic, or politically in your face it is, to raise awareness about the state of the world we're in, which is actually pretty devastating. So please give a warm welcome to Linda Weintraub.
I can't say that I intended to give a talk without any images, but no. I'm actually really pleased. I just prefer to use the ecosystem model in everything I do, and somehow being authority, speaking into the void of a blackened room, does not feel very ecocentric to me. So I'm hoping that there'll be an exchange between us, and a dynamic one. Please interrupt me if I say anything that you would like to comment on. And I have to tell you, what I'm presenting is brand new, fresh, untried yet material, so your feedback is really very welcome. So I thought we could start by engaging everybody in the issues that engage the planet as a whole. And I wonder if you might just for a moment take a kind of inventory in your mind of all this material stuff you own. How about walking through your living space and touring all of the objects that fill that space? Open up your closets. Take a look around, pull open the drawers, see what's inside. What do you have on your shelves? About meandering into the bathroom, opening up the cabinet there. Maybe things you don't use every day is stored in a garage or an attic, or perhaps you rent a storage bin somewhere. Take a look at the contents there. If you are typical of folks living in this country today, there's a kind of scenario that would describe that stuff that you've accumulated. Essentially, it comes into being because somebody has mined or grown some raw material. That material is processed somewhere to become a resource, transported to a place where it's assembled and manufactured. That manufactured item is usually then packaged and transported to some distribution center. From there, it's distributed to some marketing outlets, packaged again when you purchase it, and bring it home. Ordinarily, if all the things you own are typical, the things that you have bought have one function. They are made to perform in one particular way. And when they have completed that function, typically we don't want them anymore. And that's when the recycling issue comes into being. What do we do with the stuff that no longer is useful to us? Is it not useful because it's obsolete and there's an upgraded version? Maybe we're just tired of it and we're fickle, or maybe it needs repair and it's too much trouble to go through that repair. It's easier to buy another one. All kinds of reasons, but in the end there's a lot of stuff we don't want anymore. I did a little survey of the English language and all the words we have for this category called stuff we don't want anymore. There are a lot of words. Think of, wherever I have them, discard, scrap, debris, junk, waste, rubbish, garbage, litter, refuse, cast off. There are so many words. Each one of them has a slightly different nuanced meaning. It's as if we are connoisseurs of garbage. And the interesting part of this is there are so few words for resource. And I think it's really an indication of where our cultural values lie. We produce waste. All organisms produce waste. There's one category of waste that we and all other living organisms produce that should not be a problem. If we think of our bodies as manufacturing centers, factories, and the product that it manufactures is our life, then we bring in resources. With those resources, our bodies create life. And there's always waste generated at the end of this process. So just think of your own bodily waste. There are a lot of, for instance, cells that you're sloughing off every minute, and hair that's being shed, and nails that are growing, your sweat and your feces. And think about the greatest gift you can give to the ecosystem of all, which is your body when you die. Because all of these organic molecules are available for reprocessing. And these reprocessing channels are fully established in the ecosystem. And there are all kinds of pathways for dismantling these molecules and making them ready for a new round of functions and a new use in the ecosystem. There's a lot of this stuff. If you imagine that just among humans there are 6 billion of us right now. But the ecosystem probably can handle this pretty well. Possibly the most valuable thing you produce in all your life is your feces. It is so rich in organic matter. Of course, dumping it in potable water is a little peculiar, so we have a problem with both the water and the feces, but I actually have a friend who would like to make a point and demonstrate to everybody that this is not waste, it is not repulsive, it is not something that we should slough off and send away and banish and not see again, but something which is so useful. He has a plan to install reverse pay toilets along the highways of America and in campgrounds. And the way this system would work is that you don't pay to use the toilet. He proposes that you get paid for using the toilet. And you get paid according to the quantity and quality of what you have deposited. So this makes a really serious point, because culturally we have certain repulsions and fixations on what is useful and valuable and what is not. But from an ecocentric point of view, the very things that we often are repulsed by are really the most valuable things of all. So waste itself is not a problem if the molecules can remain active, because after all, there's only a finite number of molecules in the world. If we siphon them off and use them for one purpose, if that is functioning, that's just fine, as long as they return to the system and replenish the system at the end of it. And these organic molecules that I'm talking about are pretty easily recycled in this manner. But let's now do another kind of imagining. Instead of imagining just the stuff you own, how about imagining the other category of waste that humans produce, which other organisms don't? And that is, imagine things like broken shoelaces, old paper clips, used envelopes, old love letters, either used tissues, bath water, burned out light bulbs, spent oil, food wrappings, batteries, shoes with holes or shoes you're just tired of, your old refrigerator, your car, your outdated computer, and the myriad other material objects with which at one point you formed some relationship. Now what? What do we do with all this stuff? I invented the term CycleLogical, C-Y-C-L-E, to introduce a concept which means nothing is waste. Everything is potentially a resource. And if we could change our minds, which is where the cultural values come into play, then perhaps environmentally we could begin to contend with the second category of waste that humans are so good at generating. So the idea is banish the idea of waste, replace it with the idea of resource. What do? Suppose you're living in a culture where everything is the same, you're accumulating the same stuff gets broken, you get tired of the same stuff. However, there's a difference. There are no landfills, there are no waste collection devices, there are no dumps, and you are responsible for all this stuff that you no longer want. There is our dilemma. What would we do individually if we were responsible for our own waste products? This is definitely, hold on, let me see where I am. A challenge, and I've listed 6 ways that we might handle this dilemma. I really urge you to come on in and tell me if you think of other ways or if this should be modified, because this is an original endeavor. Here we go. So, way number 1, there is no waste, you're responsible. The first thing I propose people would probably do is try to keep their material objects functional for a very long time, because it's going to be such a nuisance at the end of this line to deal with it as waste. So I would guess that the first thing we would do is tune up our car religiously, repaint our house, keep everything in perfect condition, because once we're no longer using it, it becomes a real burden to us. The second category I would imagine we would do is to begin to look for new uses for an object once it had outlived its original use. So an example of that might be you take your empty ketchup bottle, and rather than throwing it away, you use it as a vase. A third technique would be to change the physical form of the object in some way so that this object can acquire and assume a brand new use. So an example of that might be to cut up an old tire and make a shoe sandal sole out of that object. So those are 3 ways. Fourth is easy. What do you do with your old food scrap? Biodegradable stuff is easy to deal with. We compost it, and Mama Nature has all kinds of ways of recycling this material and coming to our rescue. It's not our responsibility because the pathways already exist. More difficult is non-biodegradable material. And a lot of what we own, if you go back through your drawers and cabinets and closets, is non-biodegradable. What do we do with that? Well, one thing we might do is chemically transform a material. Suppose we have an aluminum can and we no longer want the can, but the aluminum as a resource, as a raw material, could be interesting and useful to us. Then there would be a processing device whereby we perhaps would melt down the aluminum can and get that material back to some kind of raw material so it could be reprocessed for a new use. And the 6th way, I imagine, is burning the material. So you release the energy from the molecular bonds and you can produce heat and light. So does this sound reasonable? Can you think of other techniques we might use if we were responsible for all the things we no longer want? So there we are with these 6 different methods. Not so difficult until you begin to think of the quantity of material each of us would have to contend with. In the year 2002, there were approximately 300 million Americans. In that year, these 300 million Americans generated almost 483 million tons of solid waste. That means that each and every one of us was responsible for 1.3 tons of garbage. We each have our lifestyles that we really enjoy. It's been really easy to maintain it when we send our trash off and it becomes somebody else's responsibility. A little less easy when we think of being responsible for the trash ourselves. But that's not the only problem. We've got more problems. Think of how clever we have been as a culture to extend the life of materials that might have been perishable. So we have all kinds of materials in the marketplace that bring a kind of longevity to materials that would normally erode or decay. We have wood preservatives, food stabilizers, rust retardants, fluoride treatments, Botox injections, all these things that keep our materials stable instead of making them amenable for recycling protocols. And it gets even more difficult than that when we begin to think of the fact that we as a culture have become very astute at creating new molecular bonds, inventing new materials that poor ecosystems have never experienced before. Often the goal in making these new molecular structures is that they become impervious to change. They are more strong, they are more durable. And we think of these technological changes in terms of durability and strength as advances, as progress, as achievements of our culture. So we've got materials that withstand heat, light, moisture, compaction, compression, percussion, microbes, breakage, oxidation. It's terrific if we kept our material belongings in active use for a long period of time. But it's a problem if we dispose of things quickly and need to consider alternative uses for them. So that the very advantage in terms of the material use becomes a disadvantage in terms of keeping those molecules active in our world. So just imagine, I mean, what in the world would bacteria, fungi, and vultures know to do with Teflon, Gore-Tex, and polyester? And these are all materials that ecosystems have never had to contend with before. There are no recycling strategies that are in place. Humans have invented and engineered these materials, and it seems to be human responsibility to de-engineering them, to release those molecular connections, and to return the elemental materials back into the mainstream and the active exchange of matter in the ecosystems. So at the very, very same time that engineers are working so hard to make things permanent and impervious to change and durable and strong, we've got all these other cultural forces telling us, turn over, buying new stuff is really cool. Oh, let's dispose of something, so what if it's still useful? Because the new thing is jazzy and exciting, and let's go shopping and let's have a wonderful time with all this, so that the physical matter of enduring materials is coinciding with the advertising industry and media and marketing techniques that are telling us, let's develop the psychological habit of using things temporarily and briefly. So that we have the problem of dismantling materials we have worked so hard to mantle in the first place, and to then remantle them into new functional forms. And often this requires another whole industrial procedure that is comparable to the original one that fabricated those materials and generated those appliances and gadgets in the first place. It entails assembling and sorting and transporting. There's usually an intermediate processing period when contaminants are removed, and they're resorted, compacted, shipped, distributed, and ultimately, hopefully, if all goes really well, manufactured into new products. In the meantime, think of all the energy and resources that are being utilized to conduct the recycling procedure, and consider all the byproducts, many of them being hazardous, that are generated in the process of doing all this. And we've got yet another problem, which makes it all so difficult, and that is so many of the appliances and gadgets that we use are not made out of a single material. They're made out of lots of different materials, and each material, in order to be recycled, has to be separated out and put with its own kind, because there are specific recycling strategies and methods for every different material, which even is true for plastics. You can't lump all plastics together. So we bolt things and we solder things and we make these elaborate machines that we're all so proud of and have become such a resource for us and convenience, but once we are done with them, in order to keep those molecules active, it would be necessary to unbolt everything that had been bolted, separate out all the materials, and begin to process them independently. So where are we with this psychological thought? It means not only considering our purchases originally with the thought in mind that eventually it's going to become a waste, a discard, refuse, and that is a serious part of the responsibility. But you might even think about considering your own life as an archaeologist might, in terms of looking at the garbage you have generated and wondering, what do we know about you based upon your cast-off material? What kind of lifestyle did you live? What were your tastes? What is your material inheritance for your descendants? Is it an asset because all of these materials can be reused and they're still available for your progeny? Or is it a hurdle and a burden because these materials are either taken out of circulation, landfilled, or they're contaminating? So these are our challenges. I use the word psychological because I really think that the change, if it's ever going to happen, is going to happen within the minds of each individual, that we're going to have to extend our relationship with our material belongings beyond their usefulness and their convenience to think about their ultimate distribution or disposition in the world. It is why I think artists are so necessary within this scenario. This is a challenging arena. It undermines most of our cultural values. It means starting again and establishing a whole different premise of interactions and usefulness. It demands creativity, problem solving, original thinking, ingenuity, not just coming up with methods of dealing materially with things, but of convincing other people in terms of how to change their own habits and be more considerate of the environmental needs in the post-use scenarios. Oh, thank you. So I have been writing a series of books on subjects like this, and one small unit of it is on the issue of recycling and the artists who I think are doing some really interesting work in this arena. Victoria asked me specifically to talk about the writing project because I had to deal with the fact that if I was writing something and trying to convey thoughts, I was going to probably be using matter. And if I was using matter, it's no different from every other kind of consumption production issue that I was discussing in the abstract in these books. And I'd better assign to myself the task of making a responsible decision in how I might conduct this task. And I can only tell you it was excruciating. It remains really problematic. There are no perfect answers. The arena is wide open and yet to be explored. And I can tell you the solutions I came up with at this moment, but they're not the ultimate and they're not perfect by a long shot. But one of the first decisions I had to make was I going to go electronic or paper? And this was debated by me long and hard. In the end, I decided to use a combination of the two so that I have put out, here's an example, a book with black and white illustrations to make it ultimately readable in this form, which I think the internet is not, but color images are available online. Laying a lot of color ink on a piece of paper is a disaster environmentally. And removing that ink is the first job of any process in terms of recycling paper. So I tried to create a very light look with minimum amounts of ink in order to consider those issues. Yeah. Yeah.
Because even though, you know, everyone says, oh, we don't have to use less paper because of the internet and the computer, but now there's more paper because people print out everything. And people will print out your color images with their printers, with color ink. You know what I mean? Like, even though
let me go on. And you're absolutely right. I'm trying to think of it all, okay? In order to produce this book, I decided I could not put out a book in the conventional way, which means 5,000 get produced somewhere, usually overseas, packaged, put on a boat, chug, chug, chug with all those ugly fumes going into the air across the ocean to a warehouse here in the hope that maybe 5,000 books, 5,000 people will buy them, not knowing whether that's going to be the case or not. If you should be so lucky as to actually sell books, what happens? They get repackaged, put back in new trucks, and distributed here, there, and everywhere. I knew that I could not follow that scenario. So I sought a print-on-demand method of producing the material books, which means nothing is produced materially until there is a demand for it. I'm working actually with a brand new subsidiary of Amazon, and they are able to find a printer near Nashville if I get an order in Nashville, so that absolutely minimizes the trucking and the storage and all of those other environmentally expensive aspects of publishing and distributing a book. But I'm also producing them as PDFs. And here's my dream situation, that a professor who adopts the book as a textbook will produce in the campus print shop, has ever many of these texts are required for that class. And the students get a bunch of paper with no cover and no binding, but they do get instructions on how to make their own cover and their own bindings out of recycled materials so that they become engaged in the process right away. Because covers are frivolous. Bindings are, there are so many different ways of doing it. And I really want to get to just the core of the idea. So goofy, absolutely. I came upon goofier ideas along the way, like maybe I'll produce one book and just keep it in circulation. Anybody wants it, just stand in line. But then I said, oh, then what happens? People may want it for 2 months or 3 years. Yeah. But I really did consider, I tried to consider everything. But I have a confession to make. In order to reduce packaging and transport, I lost control over the material. So my book is not made out of recycled paper. But when I looked at the big picture, it seemed that it was more responsible to consider the packaging and distribution part than the material part, since recycling paper is costly in many ways as well. Yeah? Why should I print it at all?
Just through the internet. Okay, I asked, why do you think you have to print it at all? Why do you need a printed hard copy?
From the canvassing that I've done, and please tell me if I made the right or wrong decision, people still love their books and they are much more likely to read them with care and interest if they've got an object in their hand. And that was a really hard decision, but you know the computer is not a godsend. I mean, yes, of course it's there, but it's chugging along on electricity and materials that don't separate out and recycle very well. And to condone that is a problem. I don't know how you're good in the world. I don't know how to have integrity. I mean, writing the book on recycling, frankly, has baffled me more than provided answers. But my goal in doing this is I want hopefully to inspire artists to use their ingenuity in tackling the problem to help derive solutions that don't yet exist, but also to bring them up to speed in terms of the real material, rigorous facts of the matter, because so often artists who are well-intentioned may not be as well-informed as they might be. And so the books are designed to explore the history of garbage, figure out how we have gotten where we are right now, to discuss what it means to recycle stainless steel and plastic and paper and glass and other major components of the waste stream. And then, and here we are, to give examples of what artists are doing in this field. Without slides, I will be describing works of art by 6 different artists. The first one I regret you will not see, because you would have gasped when you saw her work, and it probably would have been the most controversial of all the pieces I'm going to be showing you. It's made by an artist whose name is Heidi Lugers, L-E-U-G-E-R-S. And I became interested in Heidi's work because I saw a little reference to her in another article about something else that said she had a perfectly sustainable art practice. Sustainable art practice means she utilizes materials from the waste stream, basically woolen sweaters, and she disposes of nothing. So all the byproducts of using one part of the sweater for one object gets used somehow and incorporated into another art project. And I thought, well, gosh, she may be setting the ethical standard for the industry. I really got to get to know this person. And so I found her email and I wrote to her, and she writes back to me and she says, oh, I know about you and your work. You're not interested in what I do. And I write back and say, Heidi, I think I am interested. Tell me what you do. And she writes back and says, I know you. You're interested in contemporary this and that. No, you're not interested in what I do. Anyhow, this exchange went on. And then finally, I found out why she was being so defensive. Heidi makes cute little Santas, fluffy little sheep, and darling, irresistible dolls. And she says, I know that my work is not going to be accepted in sophisticated art circles. But, she went on to explain, it's not simply me privately conducting a sustainable art practice that is the focus of my artwork. It's conveying this ethic to members of our population who really need to hear it. And she did a survey of the demographics, all our population, and said, who needs to hear this most? The people who buy trinkets and unnecessary luxuries and cute little functionless things. And she says, now how can I communicate with them? I'm an artist. They're not going to go to a contemporary art gallery or a museum. I need to convey my ethical, environmental standards to people who are guilty of ignoring them. So the way she does this is to create consumables, trinkets, Christmas tree decorations, lo and behold, and appeals to them so that she has an in. It's a subversive art practice. She really is a subversive, political, incendiary message here. And she affixes to each of these objects a tag, and the tag discusses where the materials came from, how they were produced, and the responsibility of consumers to consider these aspects of art making. So she says, I accept that very few people would agree that what I call art is art. I accept that members of the university and curatorial systems largely dismiss my work on formal grounds. But she goes on to say, Americans have an addiction to the motifs I use, so I am giving them what they want, but under certain production terms that I can live with, production terms that we should all live with. And then the crucial statement here is, ideally, she says, they would begin to ponder production conditions of the things they buy and their consumption habits and curb their cravings. This is a conceptual art project. It looks really cute, but I think it's a clever way for her to insinuate an environmental message through the field of art to an audience that would never have access to it in any other way. And she's very popular. Stuff gets sold, you can't keep up with the orders. And so she's successful in terms of introducing an alien idea into the minds of arch consumers who go shopping for fun and sport and entertainment rather than necessity. Artist number one. Artist number two, do you know about Gelatin? Gelatin. It's a Danish Austrian art collective. And they have created a piece that is located on the top of this pristine, uncommercialized, no ski lifts, nothing area in the Alps. And this object that they have created is a huge stuffed rabbit. And I thought it would be an interesting comparison with what Heidi Lugers is doing, because though this rabbit is pink, and rabbits have a cuddly association in all of our minds, this one is positively ghoulish. It is 200 feet from the end of the ears down to the toes. Its mouth is gaping open in a grimacing kind of way, like it's taking its last gasp before it's dying. It lies sprawled on this mountaintop, face up. Its legs are kind of flopping to one side, and it has entrails spilling out onto the ground. It's meant for people to climb on. It's an extension of the mountain. So for people to get from the ground to the belly, it's a 20-foot rise. You cannot see this rabbit from on site. You have to go over it with an helicopter or possibly a distant mountaintop and look down upon it. So can you imagine this grotesque, huge bunny sprawled on the mountaintop, decaying? And that is the idea of it. So it makes it, they make it appear immediately that it is a sacrifice, it is an offering, it is death incarnate. What it is made out of is, do I have the process? 100 tons of straw, got the scale, and they were able to acquire this huge overrun of pink wool. And Gelatin members got to the town that's nearest this mountaintop and enlisted all the people to feverishly and diligently knit up this pink wool, which was then brought on site, and it was wrapped around the straw to become this strange overscaled bunny. The materials are intentionally unstable. They were made in order to decay, and the artists were delighted to report that the decaying process had actually begun before the last stitch was knotted. And here's a quote. "The rabbit is feeding a lot of other forms of life. There are already mushrooms and grass growing out of it, and there is lots of this yellow thing appearing. It looks like the doll vomited. I saw birds nesting. Cows want to lie down on the straw. The straw is radiating warmth as it decays. This is appealing to animals in winter. It's creating niches that protect animals from the wind. It stores moisture between its legs. It makes all these animals feel like home." Talk about reversing values. Here are artists who have created this huge monument with no intention of having it endure. Its intention is to decay and feed the ecosystem where it exists. To them, decay is not repulsive. It's a celebration of all the good values that we see in replenishing the vitality of the earth. Here's another quote to give you a sense of why they think this is a joyful event rather than a gruesome one. They say, "Happy you feel as you climb up along the rabbit's ears, almost falling into its cavernous mouth, to the belly summit and look out over the pink woolen landscape of the rabbit's body, a country dropped from the sky, ears and limbs sneaking into the distance, from its side flowing heart, liver, intestines. Happily in love you step down the decaying corpse, through the wound, now small like a maggot, you become like a maggot. Over the woolen kidney and bowel, happy you leave like a larva that gets its wings from an innocent carcass at the roadside. Such is the happiness with which this rabbit is made." A coup. They got the town people to agree to let the rabbit fester, decay into a rotted brown mess from the year 2005. They promised not to touch it until 2025. They are giving them 20 years. What happened? The artists convinced the people that decay is wondrous and that from an ecocentric point of view, from a psychological perspective, this is something we should relish and celebrate and not feel repulsed by. Plants and animals are sheltered and fed by the rabbit's decay. Maggots, bacteria, and fungi are burrowing into the cavities. They call it a great molecular treat. Artist number 3, questions, comments? Challenging? Yeah?
I was thinking about how when you were talking about a lot of materials, you want to use recycled materials that won't last so long. But I was wondering, like, on a history kind of perspective, like, for instance, art, a lot of the paintings that we see now were things that were archival materials, and that's why they lasted so long, and that's why we we still remember those things and still see those paintings and sculptures and in museums and everything. And I mean, how do you live your lifestyle in a psychological way if you want to make sure your culture and your history remain passed down? You know what I mean?
Well, if you're really going to be going to adopt an environmental perspective, evolution and change becomes priority rather than recording something from the past. And so it really means changing your mindset completely. Although Gelatin has this problem, and I can tell you how they solved it, and that is they are going to be coming back over the course of the next 20 years, photographing and documenting the decay, which will become a book. So is that hypocritical? Is that a rational, reasonable thing to do? What do you do when you have a message that you think is worthy of being disseminated, and maybe the only way to disseminate it is to violate some of the principles of the message you're conveying? So this is part of the dilemma. And I think you're absolutely right in raising the question. And do I have an answer? Absolutely no. Yeah.
Pass the mic, please.
Hey, I guess I've been thinking a lot about how I use certain materials and how I also want to be really considerate of the materials I use. And sometimes it seems like you have, it would be nice not to have to think about it, and so that these materials are accessible. And I think, I'm not sure, I came in a little bit late, but I'm not sure if that's what your book is about more. Because I was thinking, like, well, what if I put in 20, 30 hours on a zinc plate etching print, right? And what am is there like a respectability? Is there an appreciation? Is there like a time value to that resource, even though it's still being extracted from, a core part of the earth? I mean, I guess I'm wondering, like, I look at trees from the Tongass and we see pulp mills and we see paper, and we see that those resources that are really important are going towards something that doesn't seem very important to me. Is there an appreciation, or is that like a sort of easy way out compared to someone that's using that tree to make a totem pole, and they're spending 100 hours, 200 hours using that?
Well, I think it's up to each individual conscience to determine whether their use of some material is worthy, and I think that encouraging people to at least raise the question you're raising is a great step in the direction of some reform. But I also think that it almost doesn't matter if you think in terms of borrowing this stuff, not having it, but borrowing it. It's okay, it's yours for a while. Enjoy it. There's nothing wrong with that. But what do you do when you have no longer use for it? Then how do you return it? And that, I think, is really more crucial. So I don't feel comfortable about standing in judgment and saying this person should or should not buy the 4th sweater this week, that they already have 3, why do they need the 4th? I mean, we're all different, and we should, I think, be able to express our differences. But I think we can be responsible in terms of thinking, well, now it's mine. Now I hope to enjoy it, but it's not going to be mine forever. And part of my responsibility is to bring it back to someone else and make it useful for some other purpose some other time. Tim Gautreaux, Gaudreau, is a knockout. He creates art as if he is an alien visitor to this planet and hasn't been affected by our cultural values. And he's looking around from the perspective of somebody who hasn't been tainted by advertising or habits of consumption. And in order to bring this fresh perspective to the world, he creates posters. And the posters that he creates, again, the idea is, how do you get the message to the audience if that audience is not an art-going audience? Okay, here's Tim's solution. He creates posters and he puts them up on trees and bulletin boards in his town, and he does them with, they're black and white and they're Xeroxed and they're made with absolutely typical 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper, and they say found on top with a great big exclamation point, like someone in your neighborhood has found something that a neighbor has undoubtedly lost, and that thing is clearly a thing of value, and that neighbor, the assumption is, would want to retrieve it. So in the midst of our usual urban environments where there are glossy, elaborate kinds of advertising messages, it's amazing how much attention the little homemade image can attract. So what do you see? People look because it says something has been found. What could it be? They expect to see a wallet, maybe jewelry, maybe a pet, something of value. And what do they see when they get there? Discarded pizza box, a piece of the tops from the cans of 6-pack of soda or beer that somebody tossed in the wayside, with the following comments, okay? So for instance, in terms of the soda can, as an alien, he's looking at this as material. He has no sense of usefulness or waste, and so the identifying label says, there's a picture of the old dented soda can, and it says, might be reused as an auto part. Or a Panda Express gourmet Chinese food container that somebody tossed and he photographed. He made a poster and it says, well-worn, maybe native fetish item. And that plastic strapping for a 6-pack says, possibly jewelry fashioned from local resources. Then he says, contact me. He gives his name and he gives his telephone number so that people can come and retrieve the items they tossed in such an irresponsible way. How's that for a conscious raising kind of art? And to accompany this, he makes lost posters. So the found posters present some kind of litter and gives them value because someone has taken the time to present them and offer them back to their rightful owner. The lost posters are made in the same way, and they talk about the consequences of being careless with our garbage. So for instance, you might see a picture of a backhoe, and the statement accompanying this lost poster is lost, exclamation point, wildlife habitat, water purification, recreation, size, 50+ acres, value, priceless. And he has one lost poster with the image of a cloudy sky, and it says lost, clean air, replaced by smog, last breathed here in 1793, and then in parentheses, arguably 1492, age, infinite. And there's another one, lost, a river image. It says potable water, salmon habitat, length 410 miles, age 11,000+ years. So he's connecting our personal indiscretions. It's so easy to dump something we no longer want rather than being responsible for its reuse, and connecting them to these big environmental problems. And the two become kind of flip sides of each other. And for these, you'll find them on a telephone pole, and there again, he's going to put his name, and he's going to say, you know, this is the way you contact me. So here's an interesting statement by Tim. He says, as eco-artists, our first responsibility is to educate. I believe that when people have the knowledge, they will choose to do the right thing. Through activist public art, we can affect local, state, and federal legislation, save locally endangered plant and animal species, preserve important habitats and ecosystems, remediate polluted sites, change our community's impact on the waste stream, and so many other possibilities. Never underestimate the power of small, committed groups to institute change through example and action. How's that for a sermon of merit? And he says, email, and he gives this email action, for your own set of flyers to pin up in your town or offices. Pass the idea on. So you talked about not making an enduring work of art. Now here is Tim saying, don't give me credit at all. I don't even care if I'm not associated with this art project. I will give you the idea. I will tell you the means to do it. It's so important. I urge you to take my idea and introduce it into your own community. March on. David Brown and Greg Mann are young artists. Oh, I gotta tell you about this. Suppose you were invited for dinner. You'd be greeted by a couple of stylishly dressed young men. The table would be set with linen and nice china, vase with flowers and glasses with wine, and you'd be served a meal of fresh meat and yummy veggies and home-baked bread and ice cream for dessert. And they tell me that they love giving these dinner parties. And at the end of the dinner party, one of them stands up and says, well, I hope you've enjoyed this dinner. It's an example of our artistry, that everything you see and everything you ate came out of our art practice of dumpster diving. So they take recycling to yet another level. And they tell me that they started this project by renting an unfurnished apartment. They had clothes on their back and nothing else. And their goal was to see if they could establish an absolutely conventional middle-class lifestyle. They were not going for eccentric or impoverishment or any kind of compromises. Their goal was to be comfortable, well-fed, with all the accoutrements that we've all come to accept. They're making a log, a visible record of this by entering all of their findings day by day, and they're making a film of this. And they didn't know what to expect when they undertook this project. And I asked them, well, is it a tearjerker? Are we going to be, sympathetic for you and your deprivation and your suffering? And they laughed and they said, absolutely not, that the abundance of perfectly useful material in America's dumpsters is astonishing. If anything, it has become too easy for them to maintain their lifestyle, so that they now have invented something they call the manifestation game. And that is, rather than going out and just randomly looking for whatever someone might have disposed of, they say, today we want to find, and they'll fill in the blank. So they say that when they began this process, they already realized how easy it was, and they had lots and lots of bread, but no bread knife. So the first time they played the manifestation game, they said they were going to go out and, what the heck, let's look for a bread knife. And within a week, they had 3 wonderful bread knives. And they said, well, now they do more and more ridiculously improbable things, and they almost never go home without it. So Dave told me that Greg one day said, there's only one thing I want for dinner tonight. I want baby back ribs. And they both laughed, and they went off to do their dumpster diving. They went to Trader Joe's, and what do they find but baby back ribs still frozen with the expiration date, right? And they had themselves a feast that night. Now, they take this very seriously, and they talk about the fine art of diving. And they have really thought about it. They're not interested in rat-infested alleyways and hypodermic needles and cat litter and the yuck you might find in dumpsters. So they know how to do this. They go behind gourmet shops, electronics shops. If they're running low on shampoo and soap, they know a really nice motel in the area where they can always find what they need. And they say this is absolutely a perfectly acceptable manner of conducting their lives. So right this minute, they are about at the end of this 3-month period that they had said they would devote themselves to this project. And I asked them, what now? And they said, oh, here we go. It's a quote. We discuss the future and think it is silly to stop when everything we want is about to be buried in a landfill. And they maintain that the most important part of what they are communicating is the fact that they are living an absolutely mainstream existence. They eat well. If you had seen the images that are not working, they took pictures of their closets with all their shirts neatly lined up and their shoes on the shelf below and then their sweaters. I mean, they're fine. Their table setting is beautiful. Nothing to be embarrassed about. So they say, our project is to show that there is so much abundance in trash that you can live a perfectly average lifestyle. We want to show dumpster diving as an accessible alternative to anyone at any time without needing to drastically change one's lifestyle. We are doing this because it is a good way to procure goods. They're very insistent that they're not doing this because they're impoverished and it's a necessity. It's better environmentally, it's free, you don't have to take a job, you don't like just to buy or you don't have to take a job you don't like just to buy things. And it is way more exciting, you never know what you're going to find. So, a peculiar part of this is they have all the garbage that you would have if you had gone out and purchased these things. So they still have packaging, they still have the residue of all this stuff, it's just that they haven't bought it, they've just gotten it from somebody else's trash. So I say, well, what do you do with your garbage? And they said, well, like everybody else, I'm very conventional. Some of it we recycle, some of it goes into the trash bin. I mean, they are as average can be.
Yeah, my question is, where are they located? Because I know actually for a fact that in the city of Los Angeles, scavenging is illegal.
They're doing it outside of San Francisco. Mm-hmm. I don't know anything about the legality. They do say that they feel uncomfortable and that they would much prefer going to places where they know they're not going to be observed, but they have made themselves I Love Trash uniforms out of materials that they, of course, found in the trash, because they said when they have an official uniform, they don't feel so much like they might be mistaken for a homeless person in desperate need of food or something. And so they march off with their I Love Trash uniforms and, yeah.
What are their working hours and?
They have a problem, and that is they have too much stuff. And they talk about the fact that are they just succumbing to this materialistic drive just because everything is there and is free for the offering? Do you take it all? And so they've begun, actually I'll give you an example, to give stuff away. And they told me this really funny story. They were going to a outdoor festival of some kind, and they had to bring their own food, and they knew they had to bring unperishable food. And so they thought, well, where can we get that kind of stuff? So they went behind one of the health food stores, and they found this cache of, hold on, Nutri-Grain bars, Cliff bars, Luna bars, and vitamins, and much more than they could ever use. And they said everything was there, it was still sealed, and it had its prices on it. And so they calculated, after they took all this stuff home, how much what the stuff was worth that they got, and they came to $1,537.29. Okay? Now you say it was interesting because the only thing wrong with these things is that the labels had been water stained. And we, as a people, are not going to buy something with a dirty little label. So this was garbage for the store. So they began to go around the streets of San Francisco offering vitamins. They said every letter you could imagine. And I said, well, what were people's reactions? And they said, well, first they said, where'd you get it? And they gave them a truthful answer from the dumpster. And I said, well, then what happened? They said, most people just took a handful and went on their way. So is this an option you would any of you consider? The other interesting thing about them is that in going around through their rounds, they have on occasion come across real homeless people who won't dumpster dive. They are repulsed by the idea, and they would prefer begging for money and participating in the typical purchase consumption patterns than to help themselves to the offerings that you could find. I thought that was a really interesting kind of psychological thing I hadn't expected. Damien Hirst, everybody knows. Damien, oh, did you want to ask a question?
Test the 1, 2. I think one way to look at your talk, and from my perspective, is deconstructing and the Warhol. And another comment I like to make
whoa,
is
whoa, don't go so fast. Why? Can you tell me about that?
Well, you're dealing with everyday objects, you're dealing with trash, and you're dealing with garbage, recycle. He took garbage and made it a high art. You're taking garbage that is garbage and make it impermanent art.
So you be talking about like the boxes that Brillo.
Well, I'm looking at the general. I'm looking at the general concept, a principle.
So do you think he had in mind the fact that?
No, I don't think he had it in mind, but I think he was on the edge of what you're talking about, but not to that level.
I really think he was into the production side. What do you all think?
Well, it's all right to be in production, but what I'm saying is production not limited to production.
Okay, and what was
like process art, you're dealing with change and naturalism, matter, and impermanence. But I wanted to mention George Washington Carver, who did a lot of recycling.
Really? In what way?
In fact, he saved the crop of the South by crop rotation. And recycling products from found objects and making
another whole discussion is how we grow things.
Right.
And we don't grow things to create a natural recycling process that would keep our earth vital. And so, yeah, monoculture is really a problem. And if that's what you're referring to, it is another whole discussion, yes.
Now, do you look at your art as something to change society, or you look at it as a process of becoming something else? Is it a momentary? Is it just for the time? Are we to learn about it by reading about it, not seeing it? I'm a little surprised that you don't have photographs to illustrate your point of view. So you're drawing on the audience imagination to comprehend what you're saying, but you're saying that with power.
Yeah.
But it would be more powerful if you had a slide to go along with it.
I kind of love looking you in the eye and having a discussion, which I couldn't do if it was a darkened room in the slides. But if aesthetic nuance was essential to these works of art, I would think that it would be a real deprivation not to have the visual images. But everything I'm talking about is the concept, and it's not the craft, it is the presentation, it is the motive, and it is the way that these artists are communicating their ideas. And somehow that's less a visual, although the visuals are wonderful. I have illustrations in my book. I absolutely don't disagree with you. I don't think it's quite as essential as for another kind of art.
Do you think, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Is it okay if I go on? Then maybe we'll see if we have time at the end, okay? I'm eager to talk about Damien Hirst because he's such the bad boy of the art world, and rarely is he considered within an ecological frame of reference, and yet I think his work really makes an incredible contribution to the discourse. The piece that was such a sensation that brought his name to recognition, at least in this country, is called 1,000 Years, and it is a work that I can describe. It looks very minimal, and you might expect it to be absolutely pristine, because basically when it was new, it was a white cube and it was in this big portal. So there were two areas within this glass enclosure. And on one side, there was the rotting remains of a cow's head festering, and On it were crawling flies and maggots who were having a feast as it decomposed. Above them, there was this eerie blue light, and it was a fly zapper, an ultraviolet fly zapper, so that the animals who were feasting also had the opportunity to die in the same cavity. On the other side, in this minimal light container, is where they mated and reproduced. So within this work of art, you have the entire life cycle encapsulated. Did it smell bad? Yes. Did it look disgusting? Absolutely. As time went by, the sides became smeared with fly excrement, and the cow's head became totally repulsive. As a matter of fact, at one point it smelled so bad that Damien retrieved it. This is kind of a behind the scenes, I don't know if people know this. Burned it and replaced it. He created a kind of trompe l'oeil rotted head with ketchup and other foods that the flies would continue to eat. And he said, you know, the idea was to get people to look at this stuff, and if it smelled so bad, nobody was going to look, so he had to do something about that project, that part of the project. So I thought that was really interesting. Anyhow, why was it a sensation? Why was everybody up in arms about it? Because he was really dealing with a taboo. And the more excited people get, the more you know that they are entrenched in a different attitude. And what he was confronting is a kind of lunatic denial of decomposition that runs rampant throughout our culture. And it's hard to look at putrefaction straight on. It's not pretty, but it is definitely a reality in our world. So people were up in arms. One of the critics was outraged, and he said, for 1,000 years, remember the piece is called 1,000 Years, for 1,000 years art has been one of our great civilizing forces. Today Hirst threatens to make barbarians of us all. Why are we barbarians? Because in this work of art, death and decay are no longer abstract concepts. They become absolutely real and confrontational. We live in a culture where basically once something dies, we put it in a coffin and we close the lid and we don't look after that. And what he did was, in a way, he opened up that coffin lid and confronted us with a great drama that takes place as an organism decomposes. Excuse me for the F-U-C-K word, but that's the way Damien talks, and here we go. Here's a quote. He said, "What the fuck are we doing dying? It's so delicious. It's so beautiful. It's so fabulous. You don't have to buy a microscope to see how fabulous it is. The real gear, the stuff that we are living in, rots, and things that rot are so fucking beautiful." Dare you to say that and mean it. The other images I was going to show you of Damien's is a whole series he did called Pharmacy, which are these beautiful paintings. They're polka dots with pastel colors, and you think, what in the world does this have to do with rotting flesh? It has everything to do with it, because the colors are based on the colors of pills that we swallow in order to help delay the decaying process and keep us perpetually youthful and beautiful. And so it's a way of showing us whitewashing reality and trying to deny the facts that we are going to decay nonetheless. And he talks about the fact that we have an obsession with prescription drugs to retard age, prevent disease, and relieve discomfort. And that is an artificial situation that we impose. He says, we all die. So this kind of big, happy, smiling, minimal, colorful, confident facade that medicine and drug companies put up is not flawless. Your body lets you down, but people want to believe in some kind of immortality. Then what do we do with his shark? You know about the shark, big dead shark floating in formaldehyde. Well, what does this have to do with decay? Formaldehyde preserves us forever, right? Or wrong? I couldn't resist tattletaling. Here we go. I found this article. Recently, it says, quote, Hirst's shark disintegrating. It says, Damien Hirst's renowned sculpture that consists of a shark floating in a tank of formaldehyde is disintegrating and will need extensive conservation to prevent it from further deterioration. The sculpture was purchased by an American billionaire hedge fund manager named Steve Cohen for $12 million. Conservation scientists and natural history specialists note that the shark has deteriorated noticeably to the naked eye since it was first unveiled by the prestigious Saatchi Gallery of Art in 1992. The formaldehyde solution in which it is suspended is murky, while the skin of the animal is showing signs of wear and tear. Is Damien happy about this, or is he unhappy about this? I don't have an answer. What do you think? I mean, he talks a lot about wanting to be an artist because of all the things that humans produce. Art gets treated differently, and an enormous amount of investment is devoted to preserving works of art. So sure, we're all going to decay and everything we make is going to ultimately disintegrate, but you've got a shot at longevity if you're an artist. And I'll bet you he's really upset about his shark deteriorating so fast. Okay, one more artist in the, she's Phoebe Washburn, and Phoebe works with a part of the waste stream that is familiar to all of us, and that is cartons made out of cardboard are typically used once. Perfectly serviceable cardboard cartons are then disposed of, and new cardboard cartons are made so that they can be used once. And she clued into this amazing abundance of cardboard. She has a very rigorous art practice. So she began collecting cardboard, and she said she would never go out of her way to amass lots of it when she knew that there was going to be a stash somewhere. She said she would never take a detour. She would simply go about her life and do the necessities as they would be if she were not collecting cardboard. But she would pick up whatever cardboard she would find on her way, only carrying what she could taking what she could carry in her hands, in her arms. Okay? No pickup truck, no scavenging around at 3 o'clock in the morning before the dumpster, guys come to unload. She has amassed this huge quantity of cardboard. 2 years it took her to amass 7,000 pounds of cardboard. And her typical way of working is to flatten the cardboard, and she creates these huge, a room this size kind of construction by screwing cardboard together to create these amazing undulating patterns of form that people climb on and climb under. They're kind of mazes, and they have this beautiful, rhythmic, graceful kind of look. She'll affix them to the walls and often work from the outside in until they finally come to like a vortex in the center. They are compelling because often she includes the source material. So you'll see if it was a box that contained Kotex or Q-tips or whatever it might have been, the labels are still fragile or the side up or whatever you might see. So you really know the source, okay? So that's one kind of material that she uses to create her works of art. There are 2 other categories as well. The other are the leftovers from the construction activity. So for instance, she screws the flattened pieces of cardboard together. She won't throw away the empty boxes that the screws came in. Somehow they become a part of her installation. If she called out for lunch for herself and her workers, the packaging that the lunch was delivered in becomes a part of her construction. The rolls of duct tape, when they're empty, become included, so that the installation is a record of the entire material history of the evolution of that work of art. So those are 2 out of 3 categories. The third category is she reuses the material from one work of art to the next to the next. And so 7,000 pounds will get trucked from Kansas to New York or wherever she has a show, and then she will incorporate local materials at the same time. So she has this ever accumulating material base to work from. But none of this is why I've chosen to talk about Phoebe Washburn. I have chosen to talk about her because when I interviewed her, she began to talk about her studio practice, which is like nothing I have ever heard, okay? And I'd like to share this with you. This has never been published. She's been written about a lot of times, but I'm giving you the inside dope on Phoebe Washburn. She said, "For a few years I spent so much time collecting material. It was a driving force in my artwork. I never questioned why it was so important for me to accumulate. Now I'm trying to figure it out. I have 9 different categories of things I can't throw away. Things I might have thrown away, I place in bins in my studio. At the end of each month, I evaluate the collections. The bins fill up at different rates. When they are full, I box them up, label and date them, and mark how many items they contain." You want to know what it's like to have a psychological approach to living? Here it is. I'm going to give you all 9 categories, okay? Category 1, sentimental. This is the smallest category in my studio. It represents things I feel bad about throwing away. I have an emotional relationship to them, like invitations to friends' exhibitions. Second, collections. I have a huge wood collection, now rocks. As you know, there was cardboard. Whatever comes in units, I will keep. I can't let go. Third category, called broken. This group consists of things like dead batteries from my screw gun and pieces of wood with jammed screws. Art mistakes. This is a subcategory that consists of materials I bought but do not serve me well and things I started to make that are awful. Next one, byproduct from my own action. For instance, she says, when I cut a newspaper to use in a work of art, there's excess paper. I don't throw it away. It gets boxed. Byproduct from an external action. This category consists of the packing materials, stickers for shipping, styrofoam, and packing filler. Not done yet. Project-generated byproducts. Sticks I use to stir paint, and plastic forks and soy sauce packets that I get from ordering takeout. Another category, overlaps with life. This is becoming a catch-all from life in my apartment, but does not include anything organic. And the last one is miscellaneous debris. Here I include a bent paper clip, twisty tie, tiny random things that linger and are annoying. All right, she doesn't just stick these things in different categories in bins. She has a questionnaire that she fills out about each and every item. And she says on this questionnaire, she'll ask things like, how quickly does this item amass in your life? And how badly do you feel about throwing it away? And she has a whole list of questions. She says, when a box is closed, the corresponding questionnaire gets filed so that I can retrieve something. Heck, she may want that old battery or bent paper clip, right? And she will know exactly where to get it. This is a good feeling. The system allows me to keep my options open. And in the end, she says now that she is sending email memos to herself as if she's a corporation and this is the work of the corporation to keep herself informed about changes in the system. So if she wants to add a new category, for instance, she does it very officially by sending herself an email to institute the new policy. What do you think? Admirable or just crazy? Yeah?
I was thinking of when being ecologically minded translates into obsessive compulsive disorder. And But also, like what you described sort of seems like another category to the ways of conservation, which is like she almost worships these things that she can't throw away. And so if you can have your waste be a point of like worship, or like you deify it, then you could have your own, you could amass an idol of these things in your house that could be a point where it doesn't bother you. In fact, it gives you, you know.
What she says is a little different from that, and that is it all could be useful to me someday. And she wants to be able to retrieve it so that it will be useful again. But waiting for its subsequent use, I mean, can you imagine what she must live in, surrounded by all this stuff? It is really amazing. She's a perfectly normal woman. She is delightful. She does not seem oppressed by this habit, but she is certainly sticking with it in possibly an obsessive way. I don't know. I don't know what to make of it. I really don't. Yeah.
All of this, I kept thinking about when you were talking about all of this recycling and stuff. The experience that I've had in Greece, you know, I told you I go to Greece all the time. So living in the village there on and off over the years, I've met all these old people. I hang out with the old people. And they've shown me how to live in an ecological manner, really. But it's been based on the necessity, right? They went through the First World War, the Second World War. They have no cash. So everything that they use, it's not because they didn't want cash, but they developed this whole system, right, a way of being. It's called economia, like they're economical. But it's not just saving money, it's like a way of living. And so most of the old people, I mean, they know, the women knew how to weave, the men, you know, it was an agricultural society, right? But a prime image I have, for example, is this lady. She's cooking in the kitchen. She's like 92 years old. She's still living by herself, cooking in the kitchen, using her olive oil that she helped to collect, right? That they didn't use any electricity to grind, you know, and she loves it. She respects it. And she's wearing this dress that she's worn for years, one dress on top of another dress, because they're not used to buying new dresses and all that stuff, right? And when the sleeves, the arms got worn, she cuts off the arms and she uses them as pot holders. Oh, you know what I'm saying? And when the dress gets too old, they tear them up, they cut them up, the women, they fold them up, and they use them as kitchen towels for, you know, again and again and again and again. And then the other image is this old man. He's got his seeds in the garden, he's smoking, yeah, he bought some cigarettes, you know, and then he was like taking the seeds out of he stored the seeds from the tomatoes that he grew, that he dried the seeds and all that, you know, and then he stored them in the silver package that was the inside of the cigarette, you know, container package. So that, you know, they're creative, just so intensely creative, based on necessity.
Well, do you think
we have too much money? I think what I'm saying, you know, right now.
I'm curious about the necessity issue, because there is great pleasure.
Oh yeah.
In being resourceful that way.
Well, they had, but
it's a source of pleasure most of us have not familiar.
Correct.
With,
and I'm saying, yeah, it's complicated, the whole issues you're talking about. But there's too much money we have too much free time, we've got too much stuff, we're encouraged to buy all this. These people, because they didn't have all of this, you know, they created another system, a very, very creative system. Some of the people really appreciate it. Some of the people really enjoy the process. Some are just resentful that they don't have the money, you know, to buy everything, right? But for me, as an artist and outsider, I learned a lot from this.
Mm-hmm. You want to get this?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say briefly, this reminded me of a story that I saw on television a couple of years back, which is exactly the contrary of what you just said. It was in Switzerland. They have this garbage police. I don't know if you've heard about this. It's totally crazy. They have these people who, you know, the Swiss are quite, you know, straightforward in what they have to do. So they have these guys going around in this village. I can't remember the name, and they see if the garbage is deposited at the right place at the right time, and if it isn't, there's this garbage police that drive around that pick up the stuff and everything, like very clinically and everything, and they take it into this place. It's very serious stuff, and they open up the bag, they look everything that's inside.
As evidence of a misdemeanor?
Yeah, and then they archive everything, and they look for letters and for clues, and then they find people, and then they, they bring the people in and they tell them, look, this is your envelope with your name, and you put the thing, and they take pictures of the stuff. So it's like the whole process you're explaining of some of these artists, but the other way around, which is the police that is doing like this sort of weird creative act of archiving the garbage that should have sort of been swept away.
So what do you think? Is this a good policy?
I think is it a policy?
I mean, do you think it would be
Is it a good policy?
effective here, and you think we shouldn't?
I think it's totally wacko. I mean, they should be spending, doing what the Greeks are doing. Maybe try and put some kind of economia kind of thinking into the back.
The question is, how do you make people conscious of their actions in this way?
Well, I think it's the...
You don't? Oh, don't give up in despair. It's for all you... Oh, not that way. Now, that seems rather militaristic in a way.
Oh, no, definitely, but it's just...
Maybe you can reward the people for good behavior rather than punishing the bad behavior or something of that
No, but I think it's these inherent methods that they would want people to sort of, to be very rigorous about things. Mm-hmm. But obviously human beings, even if they're living in Switzerland, they can't be rigorous.
Then again, if we damage someone else's property, it's a punishable crime. Suppose we're damaging our shared environmental property.
Yeah.
Is that a punishable crime? I don't have an easy answer to that one, but I have to think about it. I'm not so certain that that's...
I don't know. I have some works that I do myself that are auto-destructive, which reminded me of. I do these banners with these sentences that are printed on very cheap rolls of paper, like you have for these big printers now, mm-hmm. and they're just black and white, and they're like 4 or 5 meters long. And what I do is that I stick them on the wall with the simplest things that I can put them on, with the most elementary things, and then when I take them off really with my hand, or if they rip, they break, and then I roll them, and then I take them away, and then when I have to show them, I show them with all the and so they're like auto-decaying, they're auto-breaking up, and I've totally decided that it was going to be that way from the very start. Mm-hmm. A bit like you were saying about the rabbit. Mm-hmm. It's like, it's part of it's already inherent. It's not something that we have to keep, that has to go in some kind of archive. Mm-hmm. Somebody has to repair because I ripped it and all of that business. It's inherent in the work already.
I got into a lot of trouble once when I broke museum protocols and exhibited works of art that were decrepit and torn because they had made vivid their political history. They were made by a Bolivian Aymara Indian in protest to the mistreatment of his people with the crudest of materials that he could find on potato sacks, and these were vivid, marvelous, heartfelt, stirring images. And I was not going to have any conservationists come and make them look pristine. It was not to honor the history and the character of, the way these pieces emerged. And oh my God, it was like I had violated some sacred rule in the museum world. So yeah, I honor that, and it's really wonderful to see the history. It's like, an aged face tells you about that whole life of the person, and it's very enriching. It's got a narrative, and it's a level of interaction with an audience that I think is wonderful that you're capitalizing on.
Yeah, I think there are many ways that we could take this discussion to. I could also just mention one example, which was much discussed in my my original home country, Finland. So, which is actually a very ecologically conscious country in many ways. So we have, fairly, so to say, fairly advanced recycling happening on multiple levels of different types of things, and a lot of anyway. But that especially in the 80s, we had big sort of ideological political discussions about these issues, so which way it should go and how to implement these things. So how to move from level of models to actually a level of action, of course. And much of the discussion was actually focused on one intellectual, well-known intellectual who had a university career. His name was Pentti Linkola, and actually he started, so to say, almost sort of like preaching this sort of like ideology. It's like extreme ecological ideology, which he actually came to be known as eco-fascism, you know, where he basically said that, well, okay, we have these models, but I mean that the problems we are facing are so serious that the only way of stepping from the level of models is to implement some kind of sort of like a fascist policy that will actually take these models and force these on people. Obviously, this led to a very heated debate in the society, and in the end, his solution was basically just to sort of like leave behind, you know, everything. Leave behind his career, everything, and things like that, and
I mean, he was banished.
Move to the countryside. Just start living as an ecological. Ecologically conscious fisherman living in this cottage with oil lamps, you know, and every now and then sort of like making his statements when reporters came to sort of like talk to him. But in some sense he sort of like retreated to the just sort of like living this one-man utopia. So I'm just kind of like curious, in a very general sense, that you are talking about on the level of models as well, and that you're reflecting them from this art practice and things. So I'm just kind of curious about what's your relationship to certain kind of activism or sort of like the political dimension that I think is always implied in this discourse.
Personally, I'm a great respecter of people's freedom and self-motivation. But I have to wonder, should we be free to damage the environment for our successive generations? I don't have easy answers to these kinds of questions, but my motive in addressing groups like this and doing the kind of writing I have is to enlist others into the field. We need everybody to participate. These are not issues that have ready-made easy answers. And unless lots of us get involved and contribute in some little way, I really think that we're in big trouble. So I'm a proselytizer. I feel like a missionary. I have this kind of evangelical feeling now. And everything I do is basically dealing with the college-age population, trying to enlist recruits because everyone is needed. And I feel that there's a lot of potential there among the creativity and the energy and the ingenuity and the good spirits of this generation that isn't yet being directed to environmental considerations.
Isn't it really so that at some point to be effective, it should lead to certain kind of organization, something like that.
I can't say that.
Or can you? I mean, I'm just wondering about looking at this from like a European
in
point of view,
book,
where the green movement and
in my book, I have a section on whose responsibility is it. And I raise questions. Is it the government's responsibility? Is it business responsibility? Is it just individuals, one by one, each of us? Is it the artist's responsibility? Because think about the artist is possibly the only member of our society where we don't have any established protocols and limits, and we are absolutely free to do inventing in a radical way. I mean, artists are free radicals, and I think that the situation is urgent enough that we need a big cultural mutation. A little one isn't going to do it. And who else is prepared to do that job but artists? Business people have other agendas. Government folks have other agendas. The artists are free to really address the issues. So I'm sorry, I know I'm skirting the issue. If I had an answer, I would provide it. But I do not have it. I just feel like we need to create consciousness to at least address the issues before we can even consider solutions.
I mean, just the reason why I mentioned the story about this rather crazy Finnish person is really that, I mean, that he was also very rational in the sense that he said, well, we can raise consciousness, but that before there's enough consciousness, the world comes to an end. And so that's his conclusion, was that this eco-fascism is the only solution. That was just a 80s topic in Finland.
So can I share with you some ponderables that are kind of part of all this? What do you think about this if we're going to consider all that we own and all that we are as material for reuse later on? Do you think people with breast implants, artificial joints, pacemakers, and prostheses, what do we do with these bodies when they die? Because this stuff doesn't degrade. Do we disassemble them? Right? Don't we have a problem here? How many people are walking around with steel in their legs and, okay, you're not going to be good as a corpse. I'm sorry. And what do we do about that? Should environmental agencies inspect corpses for drugs, growth hormones, preservatives, pesticides, asbestos, and other toxins before providing a permit for burial? You're going to think ecocentrically, that is certainly an issue. What about, should free burials be provided to those willing to be buried in depleted soils? Lots of interesting issues. The psychological book ends with, what do you do with this book when you're done with it? And so I make all kinds of suggestions. The pages are useful. So if you're done reading it, you don't want to pass it to somebody else, and this is an object in the world that doesn't serve you as a book with the content that it consists of, what can you do? You can dig them into your compost pile, you can burn the pages to create warmth and light, you can wrap your sandwich in them. I have a whole list of stuff. What do you do with the physical things? But more importantly than that, I say, what do you do with the concepts and information? Because I think recycling is just as much a psychological and a mental issue as a physical one. So if I may quote myself, I say, the concepts and information contained on these pages are also eligible for recycling processes. Please don't treat them as pure abstractions or theories. They are offered to stimulate action with real materials in the real world. I urge you to resist dumping the immaterial contents of the book as junk mental capital until you have considered the following possible uses. Interrogate them, expand them, discuss them with your friends, manifest them in an artwork, integrate them into your art practice, apply them to your non-art decisions, formalize them into recycling programs in your community, or use them as a basis for further investigation. Go for it. Thank you. So thank you for being patient, imageless and patient, and I'm happy to talk more if you have other ideas. I can't hear you even.
Art and the environment.
What you talking about?
You had sent me the analysis.
This is so appropriate right now because I'm actually conducting this project.
I saw this. What is it?
Yeah, and we have two other ones.